Sure.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Richard Cuthbertson. I'm from the University of Oxford, and within the Saïd Business School we have a small research centre that is focused on consumer services, and I head up that research centre with my colleague Jonathan Reynolds, who has also contributed to this research. And it's very interesting, having worked with Stephen on some of the public service issues, and as the last question suggested, or the last but one question suggested, there's a big overlap now between commercial services and public services. And one of the strengths of the service innovation triangle is that it does actually cope quite happily with commercial and public services. And I think that's a really important point to make, because we often set up barriers between the way different organisations work, and we make assumptions about what they can do or what they can't do. But every organisation has users, every organisation has consumers, every organisation has a business model. Even in a public organisation, somebody has to provide the finance, so we have to work out how are we going to provide this finance, how are we going to make this actually work. We might not have a profit motive, but there's still value created for the owners, as it were, so in that particular case, the citizens or the state. So there's always the ability to sometimes constrain these things unnecessarily, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. We've talked a lot about the Service Innovation Triangle, so I'm going to introduce it in a little bit more detail, so that you can understand what lies behind it, but I'm happy to take further questions if we wish to discuss it in even more detail. And then I'm going to relate it to Norway. So what does a typical Norwegian firm like in terms of innovation? Where are the strengths in terms of Norwegian innovation? And where are the weaknesses? Where are the areas that need to be developed more, that need more focus? And I will give a generic view. I won't pick on individual organisations, but then I will hand over to Stephen, who will talk about some individual global organisations, not necessarily Norwegian. And then he will talk about what some of the public policy issues are based on that. So, just to explain the Service Innovation Triangle, what were we actually trying to do when Pederina and I first discussed this? I guess we had three aims. The first was to create an overall model of service innovation, because one didn't exist. There were lots of models that had certain elements. So the Osterwalder canvas, for example, has a large number of elements, but doesn't really think about the other stakeholders. It's very much from the firm's perspective. So how are we going to create a better model for service innovation, understanding what service innovation is? Secondly, how can we then use that model to understand how we can create new value? And that's really about understanding where can value be created in innovation. And one of the things that has come out of the research is perhaps the obvious one, that innovation can happen anywhere. Okay, and if we look at different organisations, the innovation has sometimes come from the technology, it's sometimes come from the people involved, it's sometimes come from the market or that point in time. But innovation can come from anywhere. And thirdly, And perhaps more importantly, what does it mean for an individual firm? How can you look at your organisation? And again, when I talk about firm, it doesn't matter whether that is a commercially profit-orientated firm, organisation, or whether that's a public sector organisation. All of those firms are trying to create value. Okay? And they're trying to create value not just for one individual, but for a whole group of stakeholders. So they've all got customers, they've all got suppliers, they've all got owners. That doesn't mean to say that the customer pays, but nevertheless there are users. And so in order to achieve these three aims, what we recognised is that we had to take a very broad approach. And so what we've tried to do is to look at this from three main perspectives. I guess there's a fourth as well that's hidden behind all of this. The first one is in terms of the literature. So not to just focus on the innovation literature, but also to look at the strategy literature, the technology literature, the psychology, economics, sociology, wherever it might be appropriate. Because innovation, again, is multifaceted. It's not just based within one literature. Secondly, to not only think about the theory, but also what does this mean in practice? How does it actually work on the ground? So Pedrinho showed some of the interviews that we've done, and some of them are talking to academics and talking about what's the theory about innovation. You've studied innovation for a number of years, someone like Henry Chesbrough. What are your thoughts about these particular issues? But also we went to the practitioners and talked to them about what is actually done on the ground. How do people actually do innovation? How do they actually carry it out? And there is a lot of overlap. And then thirdly, particularly with Stephen Izel's help, we've added some case study analyses where we've looked at successful and failing organisations. We've looked through the prism of the model, through the service innovation triangle, and we've tried to think about what happened. Why did some of these things go right? Why did some of these things go wrong? Where were the blind spots? Okay? And so we'll get to that when I hand over to Stephen. So let's just review the model for some of you, because I think some of you have seen it before, but introduce it to those that haven't. The starting point is this idea of value. Okay, all of our organisations are there to create value of one form or another. Okay, so I am from the University of Oxford. It is not a profit-orientated company. It is set up as a charity. It has charitable status within the UK. It's non-profit making, but it still has value that it needs to create. Okay? And that value is through the teaching, through the education, through the research and so on. And for a whole range of people. So we will create value for individual students, which is perhaps how best the University of Oxford is known. But actually, we will also create value for clients, for sponsors of research. Hopefully for the Norwegian Research Council, for example, in the case of this particular project. So there's always a value creation element. And that's the purpose of innovation, is to create new value. And that value is created through some kind of customer or user experience. As I've said, it's not necessarily a paying customer, but it is about a customer experience. And you'll also note there's an S there as well, because there's very, very few organisations, I can't actually think of any, that only have one customer, that only have one user. Okay? Maybe if you're a butler and you've set yourself up as a company, then maybe you only have one user. But even then, you probably have the family rather than just one individual. Okay? So, and that's really important, because none of us are the same. We're horrible human beings, and we are very inconsistent, not only between ourselves, but even from day to day, even from time to time. Okay, so what I want out of the grocery store at the weekend is not the same as what I want out of the grocery store in midweek when I'm rushing in my lunch hour to go and get a sandwich. So the fact that we have to have something that is providing lots of different experiences, it creates a challenge and creates a problem for us. And the more personal the service, the bigger the issue. And it's one of the reasons why innovation in services is often much more difficult than innovation in products. When I'm developing a product, I develop a prototype, I try it out, and if it works, I can then scale it up and create production. And how the user uses that, that's up to them. But I can be fairly consistent in churning out the same product time after time after time. If I'm in services, then I don't have that luxury. Each individual customer, each individual patient, each individual user, they're all different. They all have different requirements, and they're different at different times as well. It's not even consistent in any way. So we have the challenge in service innovation. How do we develop something that provides lots of experiences, and yet we have a service system? We don't have service systems. There is no plural in systems. What we're trying to do is create one system that can provide all of those experiences. Because again, as an organisation, we can't afford to have one organisation for one user or customer and another organisation for another user or customer. Okay, so we're trying to have some kind of coherent system to deal with lots of inconsistent customer experiences. Okay? And that's the challenge. And again, very different to product manufacture. Yeah, product manufacture, it's all about quality, it's all about standard, it's all about consistency, it's all about same. We don't have that luxury in services. And how we bring all these together, because this is the delivery system by which we provide those customer experiences, and we have to provide some value. And the missing triangle here that brings these things together is the business model. And again, I just want to emphasize that the business model is not a profit model. It's just a business model. It's just how are you going to fund these things that you want to do in order to create the value that you want to create. And therefore we need to think about the business model. There's never just one business model. There's lots of different ways of doing things. And underpinning all this, we have some resources. Most organisations comprise of people, and often the chief executive or the HR will tell you that people are the most important resource. And perhaps that's true. It doesn't always feel like it. But even if we accept it's true, again, it's very difficult to manage. People are difficult to manage. They are, again, very inconsistent. And more so because we have frontline people who are interacting directly with the customer and creating their experience. And we can have exactly the same service system, but because one person gets one person at reception and another customer gets another person at reception, they can have totally different experiences. So again, we have problems in service innovation around how do we deal with this messy product. On the other hand, we also have technology supporting, in particular, the service system. and pulling all of these things together. And again, the technology, and I haven't just got, although there's one word up there, technology is also about information, it's about data, it's about the systems that lie behind that. But technology, again, provides us with some consistency. Okay? But it may also provide us with data about the customer that the people can then use that in order to flex how they deal with that particular customer. There's other resources as well, financial assets. Okay, somewhere along the line, somebody's got to pay for this. It may not be an owner as such. It may be the local government, and it may be the citizens through their taxes that are paying for this. But somebody's got to put up the financial assets. And we also have tangible assets. We have this room that we're in. We have vehicles. We have all sorts of physical assets. We have inventory that we can deal with and use in order to create innovation. And finally, to complete the triangle, we also have intangible assets, which are often more customer-facing. And they're often things you can't quite put your finger on, even though they can be very powerful. Perhaps the most obvious one of these is the brand as an asset. Okay, if I say words like Google to you, it means something. Okay, it may not be consciously mean something, but subconsciously it means something. And that's really important because that sets expectations for the customer experience. So if I say Google, most of you probably think about search, and most of you think about being able to put a search term in and getting something reasonable back, and doing that quickly and reliably. Okay, so it sets expectations. So if Google were ever not to provide that, if they were to go away and say, yeah, okay, like some of the airlines do, for example, screen waiting, just leave it 5 minutes and I'll get back to you with the answer to that particular search, then you'd very quickly stop using it. Okay, because your expectations have been set, and that's what you're expecting to happen. But there's other intangible assets. There's things like IPR, intellectual property rights. So you might actually have part of your service element you may have patented in some way. There's also intangible assets in terms of just know-how, tacit knowledge around the organisation about the way a particular organisation works. Pedro already mentioned the example of Nokia and Apple. Why is it that behind the scenes Apple can create so much innovation with 1/10 of the resources? Okay? But you have to go into the organisation to truly understand that, to truly understand what's happening. Okay. Let's just check on the time. Okay. And so what we've got here, we've got some resources which provide us with some innovation capacity. Doesn't provide us with success. It just provides us with potential. Generally, the more resources I've got, the better. Not always true, as many companies are finding at the moment. As we move into the digital age, those companies that are sitting on huge physical assets are not necessarily in a good place. So if you look at a number of retailers, for example, on high streets, book retailers would be a good example, and how they're suffering as Amazon and other such companies are taking away that space as we're beginning to use e-books and so on. They've got big physical resources, they've got lots of stores on high streets, but does it actually help them? So, as Pedrina said earlier, the key difference is about the innovation ability, the ability of management to use these resources in order to make this happen. Okay? And again, it's not a straightforward economic model. It's not just about, well, you input this and therefore you output that. It's about how you do that. So a lot of the managing people, for example, is nothing to do with the number of people you have or the number of people you have with a certain qualification or whatever. A lot of it, particularly around innovation, is about the culture of those people. What are they thinking about? How do they actually approach a particular task? Are they thinking all the time about, how can I do this differently? How can I do this in a new way? Do they even have the power and authority to do it in a new way? Or to propose doing it in a new way? Because you do want some control of the firm or organisation. So there's some very big issues around this management ability. And then at the top, of course, there's the outcome, the commercialisation or the realisation, if you like, of what is actually happening. And it's only then that you actually know whether it's going to be a success or not. Okay, so this basically provides us with a view of the firm, and you can take your own organisation and you can actually go through these different areas and think, where are my strengths? Where are my weaknesses? What are we good at? Do we have good people? Do they have a culture of innovation? What about the technology support we have? What about the way in which we put together our service and delivery system? Is that coherent? Does it make sense? And so this is very much a tool that you can use for looking at your own organisation. Let's have a think about, you've slightly missed the title here, but Norwegian characteristics in general. I'm not going to talk about a particular firm. But from the research we've done, this partly reflects some of the survey material that Stephen presented. Where are the strengths and weaknesses of a Norwegian firm? And I'd be interested in your agreement or disagreement. Both are absolutely fine. Intangible assets. Generally, Norway's pretty good. We're in this building now. There are some very good physical assets out there. And most firms have very good facilities. Financial assets. Generally, there's good access to finance in Norway. It's an affluent country. Maybe there's difficulties in finance if you're going to do something that is very risky, because it's a fairly risk-averse culture. But nevertheless, finance is available. When you get to intangible assets, though, yeah, some of that's good, particularly at a local level. But when we start to think about how does Norway spread, how has it made an impact on the rest of the world, then there start to be some potential weaknesses there. And particularly we were discussing actually on the way down here, what are the top 5 companies in Norway? And I was asking my American friends, because I thought this would be interesting. Because if I were to ask you, name some American companies, I think most of you would manage to name a few American companies. And my American friends, not to embarrass you, they could potentially name one. Okay? But this is about intangible. This is about how does so if you do some innovation locally, does it actually get out anywhere? Because when Google do some innovation locally, they're not just thinking about, hey, this would be nice, we'll share this with the rest of Silicon Valley. And go no further. And innovation is about ambition. And And Silicon Valley is certainly a place of ambition. Okay? So, technology. Again, in Norway, most firms have good technology and good application of technology. Okay, there's some good skills around hardware, software, data, information. These are all generalities, of course. I understand that individual firms will have different strengths and weaknesses. And people, good individuals, good little cliques and groups of innovators. But again, I would question the broad culture within an organisation. You can think about in your own organisation, you may be very innovative. How easy is it to get the rest of the firm behind you in order to change things, in order to develop things? Because again, if we look at somewhere like Silicon Valley, which we think of in terms of innovation, if somebody's got a new idea there within a firm, if somebody in Google thinks, hey, why don't we do, you can be sure there is a process and a way of them being able to pursue that, if it makes sense. There'll still be some, it won't be just, yes, open house, do whatever you like. There'll still be processes and procedures and bureaucracy, even in Google. But nevertheless, the attitude will be encouraged. And the service system, again, usually very good. Most firms are very competent at what they do. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean it can be replicated. It doesn't necessarily mean it can be taken from one place and put in another. Customer experience is a little bit mixed there, partly because of the geography. So certainly from a service point of view, we have highly educated, generally affluent customer base, so they're very sophisticated, but there's not always a great deal of choice because the scale is not necessarily there. Business model. It was interesting that we had a question about business models earlier, because I'm going to pick up on this one. Generally underdeveloped. Generally in the public sector there is a certain business model and this is how we do things. But even in the private sector, I would argue that most of the business models are about sticking to the conventional, sticking to what is known and observed, and also being very open and visible. Yeah, so if somebody has to pay for something, then they have to pay for it. Unlike Pedringer's example earlier with Ryanair, where if somebody has to pay for something, actually the airport can pay for it. It doesn't have to be the direct customer, as it almost never is in the public sector in Norway, in social services, for example. And so therefore the value, I think most Norwegian organisations are really good at creating value locally for their constituents, for their community, for their existing customers. But they're not necessarily very good at taking that beyond that. And that's partly due to things like geography. It's partly due to the fact that if you're in Silicon Valley, you can think of the US with its, 450 million people, however many it is. But also, whereas in Norway you can't do that. However, it's quite interesting that the issues are not necessarily as obvious as you think. So, for example, there's a lot of laws between different states in the US that are very, very different. Whereas there's a lot of laws across Europe that are actually quite similar across European states. Similarly, there's some big advantages to being in Norway. because it's a relatively homogeneous population. Whereas if you go somewhere like the States, there's probably every different kind of person on the planet living there. So there's an even greater diversity that has to be dealt with. So overall then, and I'll conclude on this, but I'm happy for you to offer questions. Norwegian firms, I should say, are pretty good on the putting something together that makes sense, that is competent, that delivers what is actually required, and moves on and develops as time develops. And in particular, the sort of production side of service systems, the idea of putting something together that's consistent, that keeps the quality at a high level and so on. But there are some weaknesses in terms of some around value, customer experience and people, but that's a little mixed. And some strong ones around the intangible assets and particularly the business model. And I think that's partly geography. That certainly doesn't help necessarily, but it doesn't necessarily stop things happening either. If we take the example of Silicon Valley, it's not just about a physical idea, it's about a mindset as well that says, I'm going to create an innovation in order to change the world, in order to conquer the world. Okay, it's not I'm going to create an innovation in order to make it good within my particular firm or my particular location. And I think that level of ambition is a very interesting one, and one that is something that is very difficult to change over the short term. But in actual fact, I think we look at this, and Norwegian firms have lots of real strengths, and this is a platform from which I think they can really develop well. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Stephen, who's going to look at a similar triangle, but start to think about some other companies that you will have heard of.